Welcome to History's Greatest Battles. Season 1, Episode 4, The Battle of Mukden of the Russo-Japanese War, 19th of February 1905 to the 10th of March 1905. Sources vary, but leading historians believe the Japanese had from 200,000 to 320,000 soldiers in 5 merging armies, while the Russians had between 200,000 to 310,000 soldiers in 3 armies.
As the 19th century drew to a close, China found itself economically shackled by the ambitions of foreign powers, its sovereignty eroded by relentless external pressures. Britain, France, Russia, Germany, and Japan had carved out spheres of influence across the Chinese landscape, each power establishing a near-total monopoly over its allotted territory. In 1899, U.S. Secretary of State John Hay sought to disrupt this sectional dominance with his open-door policy, a bold initiative aimed at leveling the playing field through the promotion of free trade. While the foreign powers nodded in cautious agreement, Russia's cooperation was begrudging at best, its reluctance simmering just beneath the surface. The Russian bear, driven by insatiable greed, continued to bar foreign competitors from its prized economic zone in Manchuria, where it sought to solidify its grip. Japan, a nation brimming with ambition yet starved of natural resources, cast its eyes on Manchuria, viewing it as a treasure trove of coal and iron, vital to fuel its burgeoning industrial and military might. In a bid to secure its future, Japan attempted to negotiate with Russia over trade in Manchuria, but their efforts were met with obstinate resistance, making little progress. Russia's promises, as cold as the Siberian winds, amounted to nothing. Meanwhile, it quietly fortified its military presence in Manchuria, preparing for the inevitable clash. By 1904, the futility of further negotiations became clear to Japan, and with the resolve hardened by necessity, it began preparing for the war that now seemed inevitable. In the cold early days of February 1904, the Imperial Japanese Navy struck with the swiftness of a hawk, launching a surprise assault on the Russian Pacific Fleet stationed at the strategic harbor of Port Arthur. The attack crippled Russian naval power in the region, clearing the path for Japan's forces to land on the Liaotung Peninsula in late April, where they commenced the grueling siege of Port Arthur. On May 1, 1904, emboldened by their dominance in Korea since the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, Japanese troops crossed the Yalu River, brushing aside minimal Russian resistance as they initiated their landward invasion of Manchuria. To the world's observers, Japan's chances seemed slim. How could this small, resource-poor nation possibly triumph against the might of the largest empire on Earth? Moreover, the very notion that an Asian army could defeat a Western one was beyond the comprehension of European observers, steeped as they were in the prejudices of their time. Yet Japan, undeterred by the skeptics, shattered conventional wisdom, delivering one crushing defeat after another to the stunned Russian forces. By late August and early September, Japanese forces seized the city of Liaoyang, a decisive blow that left the beleaguered Russian troops at Port Arthur dangerously isolated. In a desperate bid to break the siege, Russian forces launched a counterattack at Shaho in October, but their efforts were brutally repelled by the determined Japanese. On January 1st, Port Arthur finally fell, its defenders capitulating after months of unrelenting siege, freeing the victorious Japanese army to march northward and converge on the Russian stronghold at Mukden. General Alexei Kuropatkin, commanding a force vastly superior in numbers to the Japanese, found his army hamstrung by outdated combat doctrines, the relics of a bygone era. The Russian troops had been trained in the brutal art of shock tactics, where victory was sought by hurling wave after wave of bayonet-wielding soldiers into the fray. It seemed the lessons of the American Civil War had been lost on the Russian high command, for they clung to tactics rendered obsolete by the era's devastating advancements in firepower. Russian artillery, intended to support both offensive and defensive maneuvers, was deployed so sparingly that it rarely achieved the overwhelming firepower needed to turn the tide of battle. To compound their woes, Russian infantry and artillery units were bogged down by the need for vast reserves, often matching the number of troops already engaged in the line. In stark contrast, the Japanese forces, under the command of Marshal Iwao Oyama, had been rigorously trained in the Prussian military tradition, a school of thought that emphasized precision and modernity. For the Japanese, firepower reigned supreme, with advancing troops expertly using every inch of cover, while artillery fire rained down in perfect synchrony to support the infantry's advance. The clash of these two contrasting doctrines meant that, despite being the younger and less experienced force, the Japanese army was far better prepared for the war, while the Russians, bound by their outdated practices, often failed to commit their forces in time to seize the initiative. Kuropatkin, determined to halt the Japanese advance, positioned his three armies, an imposing force of roughly 200 to 300,000 men, in a formidable defensive line south of Mukden. Spanning a 90-mile front, his troops dug into their defenses, preparing for the storm that was sure to come. The eastern two-thirds of the Russian line were securely anchored in the rugged, imposing Talan Mountains, offering a natural stronghold. The western third of the line extended from the mountains to the Hun River, its length fortified by a series of strongly defended villages and towns that served as bastions against the Japanese advance. On January 9th, Kuropatkin ordered a cavalry reconnaissance to unearth the Japanese positions, but the Cossack units he sent were deftly outmaneuvered, returning with reports that misrepresented the true scope of Japanese intentions. Misinformed by these reports, Kuropatkin believed that the Japanese had yet to arrive in force on the western flank, unaware that Marshal Oyama's troops were nearly poised to strike. As a result, Kuropatkin dangerously thinned his defenses on the western flank, leaving it vulnerable to the coming onslaught. The battle commenced on January 26, 1905, as Kuropatkin launched a bold offensive aimed at the heart of the Japanese lines. The town of Sandepu became the epicenter of fierce combat, changing hands thrice in 2 days, amidst the chaos of a raging blizzard that added a bitter edge to the bloody struggle. Although the Russians secured Sandepu on January 27th, a swift Japanese flanking maneuver soon forced Kuropatkin to retreat to his original lines, relinquishing the initiative to his adversary. This retreat not only handed the momentum to the Japanese, but also delivered a crushing blow to the already fragile morale of the Russian soldiers. Bolstered by the arrival of the battle-hardened Third Army from Port Arthur, Oyama unleashed a powerful offensive on February 19th, determined to break the Russian lines. The Japanese began their assault by striking at the strongest point of the Russian defenses, the eastern flank, entrenched in the rugged mountains. The Japanese advance was slow and costly, but it was relentless, ultimately compelling Kuropatkin to commit his precious reserves to the embattled eastern flank. Seizing the opportunity, Oyama then unleashed his second army against the weakened Russian western flank, while the Third Army executed a sweeping maneuver across the Hun River, aiming to outflank the Russians and sever the vital railway that sustained their forces. After over a week of brutal, close-quarters fighting in the mountains, the success of the Japanese flanking maneuver forced Kuropatkin to order a retreat to Mukden. On March 2nd, Kuropatkin established a new defensive line on the north side of the Talan Mountains, drawing his right flank back in a north-south alignment to safeguard the critical railroad. With the Japanese forces now free of the mountainous terrain, they launched a larger, more sustained assault, driving the Russians back within a week to the Kamalin Mountains on the east and the Mukden-Harbin Road on the west. With the specter of complete encirclement looming, Kuropatkin ordered a desperate withdrawal on March 10th. This retreat saved the bulk of his forces from annihilation, but not without severe casualties inflicted by relentless Japanese artillery fire. The casualty figures from the Battle of Mukden are a grim testament to the ferocity of the fighting, with estimates ranging from 20,000 on the low end to 156,000 Russian casualties, and 53,000 to 70,000 Japanese losses. While Japan likely suffered more in terms of killed and wounded, the Russians endured a different kind of loss, with significantly more of their soldiers captured and taken prisoner. Despite his triumph, Oyama fell short of his ultimate goal. He could not completely annihilate the Russian army, which remained a formidable presence. Though Japan now controlled Port Arthur and the Liaotung Peninsula, the continued existence of a Russian army meant that true security remained elusive. Mukden strained under the weight of its supply limitations, while the Russians still held the crucial railway that funneled reinforcements and supplies from the vast western expanses. Strategically speaking, the Japanese victory at Mukden fell short, unable to deliver the decisive blow that would end the Russian threat. Japan's forces had not only reached the physical limits of their supply lines, but also the outermost boundaries of what the Japanese government and economy could sustain. Russia, by contrast, still possessed untapped reserves of both troops and industrial capacity, holding the potential to prolong the conflict. Yet in the end, these advantages amounted to nothing. Despite their material ability to continue the war, the Russian government and its people were psychologically broken, unable to bear the strain of further conflict. The string of defeats at the hands of what was presumed to be an inferior enemy shocked the Russian government and high command to their core, leading to Kuropatkin's resignation in disgrace. As news of the defeats spread, the Russian monarchy, already beleaguered by pressure from radical factions, felt the noose tightening around its authority. Revolution soon erupted, and though it was brutally suppressed, the uprising convinced the Russian leadership that a negotiated peace with Japan was not only desirable, but necessary. In a calculated move, the Japanese government secretly instructed their ambassador in Washington to seek the mediation of President Theodore Roosevelt. Seizing the opportunity, Roosevelt publicly invited both nations to send representatives to Washington offering his services as their mediator. Russia, cautious and wary, agreed to the talks only on the condition that Japan publicly accept the invitation first. In early August 1905, negotiators from both sides convened in the stifling heat of Washington, D.C., before relocating to the cooler and more serene setting of the U.S. Naval Base at Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It was there, on August 23rd, that the Portsmouth Treaty was signed, bringing an end to this bloody conflict. Under the terms of the treaty, Russia ceded the Liaotung Peninsula, including the strategic harbor at Port Arthur, to Japan, acknowledged Japan's dominance in Korea, and relinquished control of the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Japan sought to extract war reparations from Russia and retain captured Russian ships, but these demands were ultimately rejected, forcing Japan to return the vessels. Roosevelt, ever the shrewd diplomat, persuaded the Japanese that these concessions were minor compared to their overarching achievement, gaining access to Manchuria's coveted resources. The battles of the Russo-Japanese War offered an ominous preview of the trench warfare that would ravage France in World War I, though few recognized the significance of these early lessons. By now, the Industrial Revolution had firmly entrenched itself in the military domain, evidenced by the mass deployment of artillery and the emergence of a fearsome new weapon, the machine gun. The sight of armies entrenched with overwhelming firepower, a harbinger of the battles that would ravage France a decade later, became the norm in Manchuria. Yet only Germany had the foresight to absorb and apply the lessons learned. Keen observers noted the deadly efficiency of machine guns and ensured the German army was well equipped. It would take the British and French, the bitter crucible of battle in France, to learn the same hard lesson. Japan's stunning victory solidified its status as a military power of international repute, commanding newfound respect on the global stage. The victories at Port Arthur, Liaoyang, and Mukden not only proved Japan's military prowess, but also shattered the long-held belief that the West alone possessed superior martial skill. Once isolated from the world between 1600 and 1854, Japan had been forcibly opened by U.S. Admiral Matthew Perry, thrusting it onto the global stage. Confronted with the overwhelming technological advantage of the West, Japan's government propelled the nation forward by centuries in just a few decades, transforming society at a breakneck pace. The Russo-Japanese War served as that crucible, proving the effectiveness of Japan's rapid modernization and its newfound military strength. The war in Manchuria, culminating in the Battle of Mukden, marked the moment when two great powers crossed paths on divergent trajectories, one ascending and the other in decline. The Russian Revolution of 1905, though ultimately suppressed, sowed the seeds for the seismic Menshevik and Bolshevik revolutions that would erupt in 1917. Japan, on the other hand, was an empire on the rise, its star ascending ever higher in the east. Over the first decades of the 20th century, the Japanese army's influence grew to such an extent that by 1931 it effectively controlled the government, driving Japan to invade Manchuria once more and setting the stage for the full-scale invasion of China in 1937. The Japanese Navy, which had also emerged from the Russo-Japanese War as a formidable force, combined with the army to create the military juggernaut that would propel Japan to dominance in Asia. The simmering public discontent with the terms of the Portsmouth Treaty laid the groundwork for a burgeoning rivalry between the U.S. and Japan in the Pacific, a rivalry that would eventually erupt into the cataclysm of World War II. Japan's victory reverberated far beyond the battlefield, leaving a profound psychological impact across all of Asia. For centuries, Western colonial powers had held Asia in their grasp, dominating its lands and peoples through a relentless series of conquests and takeovers. Until 1904-1905, no Asian nation had successfully stood against the might of a Western power. Japan's triumph over Russia heralded a sea change in Asian attitudes towards Western dominance, a shift that would be echoed in later victories over the British at the start of World War II. igniting popular movements that would ultimately dismantle most Western empires.